surprised to see an empty seat at the FA Cup final at Wembley Stadium. A die-hard fan commented to the woman sitting on the other side of the empty seat, "I'm really surprised to see an empty seat at the final." "It was my husband's," the woman explained, but he died. "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that." A bit more of the match plays on, and he thinks about it a bit more, and he says, I'm really surprised that a relative or a friend didn't jump at the chance to accompany you to the final and take your husband's seat that was reserved for him." "Beats me," she said. "They were all set on going to the funeral." Of course, it's a funny story. A bit dark, but it's funny. And a fictional one, by the way. I think. But it raises the question, doesn't it? Where are your priorities? Who or what is most precious to you? Because the answer to that question will determine your actions. In fact, I would say that your actions are a better indicator of where your heart is than your mouth is as an indicator. We may say one thing, but what do we do? We can easily claim love for someone or claim allegiance to a cause, but do we act on that claim when the rubber hits the road? When we come to do life, when we weigh up our options and count the cost of each action, depending on where we see value, depending where we see most importance, that will affect our actions. So take the woman in this comical story as a ridiculous example. She thought that going to her husband's funeral, she thought about it, but when she weighed it up against the FA Cup final, she chose the cup final. She counted the cost. She weighed them up and decided that going to her husband's funeral was not worth missing the FA Cup final. Let's be honest. We can be more like that woman than we may care to admit. We prefer to seek our own comfort and our own enjoyment over things, over church, over others, sometimes even over Jesus. And in Luke 14:25-35, Jesus calls out to those who would be his disciples. He calls to them and he says, he commands them, he compels them even to make a choice. Who will be first in their lives? Who will be the priority? That's an important thing for us to consider this evening as well, isn't it? When the hard times come, will Christ be enough? Do we value him enough? Do we get what he's done for us? Let's look at our text then. Verse 25. Now great crowds accompanied him, and he turned and said to them. Great crowds accompanied him. As we've commented in the past few weeks, Jesus is on his way to Jerusalem. And that means only one thing for Jesus, doesn't it? He knows what it means. It means the cross. It means pain. It means scorn. It means shame. It means suffering and death. And it means obedience to his Father. But Jesus looks around and it seems as though those all around him seemingly are oblivious to his fate. There are great crowds with him. And perhaps if we dare to step inside the mind of Christ, perhaps he's thinking, would they all be here if they knew where I was going? Would they all be here if they knew the cost? These folks perhaps saw themselves as participants in the victory march of the Messiah. We're going to march on Jerusalem. We're going to take it back. We're going to conquer the Romans. And they wanted to be there when Christ takes back his throne. You see, the crowd may have been enthusiastic, but it was an uncomprehending enthusiasm. And I think that's borne out, isn't it, in Passion Week when we see them turn and change when they see what's actually happening. You see, to Jesus, the crowd was not a sign of success in his ministry, but rather it was a problem that needed to be addressed. The crowd was walking with him, but were they walking with him? And so Jesus says, do you know the cost of following me? Do you know what it costs to be with me? Do you know what it's going to take? Do you know what it's going to look like? Do you understand? Have you actually thought this through? Are you going to be here in a week's time? Are you really with me? And so Jesus says in verse 26, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. Let's just say straight out, that's incredibly offensive. It's incredibly offensive. Jesus spares no one who claims to have a disciple's commitment. Jesus makes it clear that the desire to go after Jesus, to follow him, that's a good one. It's a great one. But it's not to be considered casually. Discipleship, following Jesus, being one with him, being a Christian, all of it means the same thing. It's not an easy task. There is great cost to it. There can be great cost to it. And Jesus does not hesitate to lay out what that cost is, even though it would have been incredibly offensive to his listeners. If anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. To be a follower of Jesus isn't a hobby. It isn't something we choose to do to fill in the empty spaces of our lives. Something we put in the empty spaces in the calendar. There is no such thing as a Sunday Christian. The call to follow Jesus is a call to allegiance and devotion. Jesus refuses to be an afterthought in any of our lives. He refuses to be a pleasant diversion. He refuses to be a fad in the lives of those who claim to follow him. And so Jesus says this really quite offensive thing about hating family to a crowd that lived in a society that valued family commitment above all else. You may think you love your family, but in this culture it was even greater. The call to family was above anything else. And Jesus says, you must hate your family. It's offensive. But did Jesus really want the crowd to hate their fathers and mothers? Is that what he's calling them to? You can imagine one of his disciples goes home, Mum, I'm following Jesus. Okay, that's great. No, Mum, I hate you. I don't care if you think it's good or not, I hate you. I don't think that's what he's going for, was he? Was he really calling them to hate their fathers and mothers, their wives, their children, their brothers and their sisters? Well, we have to say, of course, he didn't. Jesus elsewhere is very clear that we should love one another. We should love our neighbours as ourselves. That's what we're called to. And then there's very explicitly the fifth commandment, to honour our father and our mother. And Jesus wasn't pushing all of that aside. Jesus, of course, is not calling his disciples to despise their loved ones. Jesus uses the word hate in a rhetorical or comparative way. In other words, the call to hate simply means to love less than. So it's not that when we become a Christian, when we decide to follow Jesus, then we should stop loving our family. It's not that we should love them any less than we did before we were saved. No. Because if anything, when we're saved, we should love our family more, shouldn't we? Now filled with the love of Christ, having his mind, having his heart for others, we are compelled to love them in an even greater way than we did before. With a truly self-sacrificial, Christ-like love, we should love them. So it's not that we should hate them. Rather, when we love our family, what Jesus is saying is our love for our family, when it's compared to our love for Jesus, for his call and his ministry, that love for our family, in comparison, seems like hate. It's not a diminishing of the love we have for our family, but an extreme increase of the love we have for Jesus. Let me try and illustrate it. If we were to come back here tonight at midnight, and we were to board up all the windows, switch all the lights out, so it was completely dark as it could be. No hints of moonlight streaming in, like pitch black. And if I stood here and I lit a match, you would all be able to see it. It would appear quite bright. It would be welcome. You'd be able to see it up from the balcony. You'd be able to see it from any point in this auditorium. But if we then turned every single light on, turned these spots on to full blast, they're not on full blast, and I'm very grateful for it on a warm day like this, but we turn them on to the max, the light given off by the match in my hand would seem like darkness compared to the light that's been given off by everything else. Do you see? It, of course, isn't darkness. It's still light, but it would seem comparatively dark. You perhaps wouldn't even be able to see it. So it is with our love for family. Our love for family, it should be bright. It should be welcome. It should stand out in this dark world. Of course it should. But when compared with the incomparable brightness of the love that we are called to have for Jesus, who has saved us, who has given us life, who has brought us back to God, who has bought us back for God, well, that love for our family would comparatively seem dark and dim. And so dark and dim, in comparison, it would seem to be hatred. And so Jesus is not talking about animosity. He's not calling us to dislike them or hate them. But he's talking about priority. That Jesus should be so far and above our priority. And Jesus' challenge to his audience is, what is your priority? Is it your family? Is it these other things which culturally are so important? Or is it going to be me? I hope that makes some sense as an illustration. And so the same question comes to us, doesn't it? What is our priority? What is our priority? And at this point, I just want to address two questions that there may be in the room that we may have on our minds. Unfortunately, I've heard them before. They might not be in the room, but they have been asked. And they are only ever asked, by the way, in plush, warm, safe rooms like this in the West. The first objection is, well, this doesn't really apply to me because I'm a Christian, but I'm not a disciple. I don't know if you've ever heard that. I must admit, when I first heard it, it was news to me that there was a difference. But let me address it anyway for the record. As Christians, we are disciples of Jesus. That's what we're called to be. That's what we must be. To be a disciple is not, well, I've become a Christian. Maybe later on I'll think about becoming a disciple. Rank up, level up. No. It's not some higher level of Christian. We can't just say, well, I'm just a Christian, I'm not a disciple. A disciple is not some second-tier Christianity. The Bible dictionary definition of a disciple is simply the pupil of a teacher. Somebody who learns from somebody else. That's it. So to say, I'm a Christian, but not a disciple, is to say, I'm a Christian, but I'm just not learning from Jesus. I'm a Christian, but I'm not following Jesus. And I think we can agree that's a juxtaposition of terms. They just don't go together, do they? So that's just the first little point. This does apply to you this evening, Christian. Secondly, and I get this, some object to the idea that being a Christian is in any way costly. oh, we don't really like the sound of that, do we? It grates against the gospel. It grates against what we understand as a free offer of grace and that Christ has done it all. And so I acknowledge there is a tension there. We must walk that line very carefully. Of course, we don't want to fall into works-based legalism, but equally it'd be wrong to fall into antinomianism. We must carefully balance Scripture very carefully in thinking about this. So, in answer to that objection, let me say this. These costs are what discipleship may entail for a believer, but they are not entrance requirements to the kingdom of heaven. They are what may entail for a believer, but they are not entrance requirements to the kingdom. What I'm getting at here is, we may say, I hope maybe someone here this evening is thinking, forsake family? I shouldn't have to do that. Christ has done it all. There should be no requirement to following Jesus. I haven't had to forsake my family to be a Christian. What's he talking about? To which I would say, count your blessings then. Try being a Christian in Somalia, or Iraq, or North Korea, or Syria, and then tell me it doesn't cost anything to follow Christ. If our allegiance and our devotion to Christ is never tested, we are in danger of being like the crowd around Jesus, enthusiastic but uncomprehending. We call ourselves followers, we call ourselves disciples, but we are blissfully ignorant to what it might cost following Jesus. And so the question comes, if these trials come our way, will we stand? Will Christ be enough? And so we must first count the cost. Will Christ be enough when that thing happens? That awful thing, will Christ be enough? The issue isn't then, are you doing these things? Are you hating your family? Are you giving away everything? Are you hating your life? Are you being scorned by your family? Are you being hunted by your governments? Because if that was the question, most of us would have to say, well, no, I'm not. But the question rather is, are you willing to? It's perhaps harder to answer. Are you willing to? It's a hard one to know, and so we must count the cost. I also want to say that I know that many of you already know the cost of discipleship. Many of you already know the cost. You've already counted the cost, and you know personally the cost of following Jesus. I know there are some here this evening for who that will be true. Those of you perhaps with unbelieving spouses, you know what Jesus is talking about here. You're living it. I may encourage you to persevere. Jesus is enough. Persevere. It's costly. There are other ways we know the cost of discipleship as well. The things that Jesus calls his disciples to comparatively hate in this passage were the most important things to that culture, as I've said. So let me ask, what might it look like for us today then? See, family is not the most important thing in our culture anymore, is it? What is then? What might it be that we are called to forsake or love less because of our love for Christ, which comparatively is important in our culture? And I would suggest two things: sex and the freedom of sexual expression. These two things, and we could argue about it, but I picked these two. I think they're right up there. I would argue are possibly two of the most important things in our culture. Things which our culture would attach almost a religious devotion to. You see it, don't you? Campaigners. People, if you dare disagree with them, you're intolerant. Which, by the way, is ridiculous and ironic. And so if we are called to hate these things, it can be hard for us. If you are single and unmarried and you are committed to Jesus, committed to following him, you're going to have to forsake sex. You're going to have to give that up. Maybe for your entire life, and that's a high price that many pay. In our culture, if you are celibate, if you choose that, people don't understand that. In fact, people find it offensive that you've chosen it. To our celibate single person, young and old, persevere in counting the cost. Thank you for honouring marriage with your bodies in your singleness. Keep looking to Jesus. He is worth it. Equally, the idea of freedom of sexual expression. If you are same-sex attracted, the world tells you to love and sleep with whoever you want, male or female. But in following Jesus, in following Jesus' call that we forsake that cultural right and deny that part of ourselves, that desire that perhaps you were born with, is costly. It's difficult. And I have Christian brothers and sisters for whom this is a real daily battle. And if that's you, keep counting the cost. There are people among us who are counting the cost in ways that many of us will just never know. Maybe never experience, and maybe never know what they're going through. Be mindful of that as you love one another. We may never think about it. We may never be able to understand it. But how can we love and serve each other in these things? How can we walk with one another? There's just a couple of thoughts there. But what I really want to get to then is this. Don't tell me that there is no cost to following Jesus. The cost is great. And Jesus likens it to the cross. To bearing the cross. Verse 27, whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. Now, the idea for us of having to bear our cross makes complete sense to us, doesn't it? Living after the cross. But even to Jesus' original hearers here, the cross was an instrument of grief, suffering, pain and death. And they immediately would have understood what he meant to bear the cross. This would have jarred his original listeners, just as it should jar us. Oh yeah, I bear my cross. Really? Do you get what that means? The cross is not a pleasant thing. We may have our necklaces, perhaps, and that's fine. We may have ornaments of the cross, but may the cross never become just that pretty little trinket we have. I heard a story about a pastor who was once given the red carpet tour of another minister's church. And with pride, the minister took him round the church and he pointed out the rich imported wood of the pews, the luxurious decoration of the building. And as they stepped outside, darkness was falling and a spotlight shone on a huge cross atop their steeple. That cross alone cost us $10,000. The minister said with a satisfied smile. And the visiting pastor replied, "Really? You got cheated. Times were when Christians could get them for free." It's true, isn't it? It's not a pretty decoration. It was a form of execution which Christ went through. This is where Christ was headed, to Jerusalem, to the cross, to suffering and death. And he calls us to bear our cross with him. Jesus' invitation is to identify with him in the dishonour and suffering of the cross. To bear the cross was a shameful thing. To bear the cross is to give up your claim to things which other people consider rights. To bear the cross is to forsake comfort, to forsake companionship, to forsake all the things you have, and to forsake life itself. Now, not all of us will be called to die for our faith in Jesus. In fact, I would guess probably hardly any of us in this room. But I wouldn't rule it out. We must be prepared to. Are we? Have we thought that through? Discipleship is not cheap. In fact, it's infinitely costly. As Martin Luther said, a religion that gives nothing, costs nothing, and suffers nothing, well, is worth nothing. Are we willing to pay the price? Are we willing to pay the price of following Jesus? That's the question he asks us. But, he says, don't answer rashly. Don't answer in a hurry. Actually, just for reflection afterwards, this is an interesting thing to think about as we do our evangelism. We've seen throughout Luke that Jesus has been revealing who he is. He's been asking the question, who do you say I am? And then he moves his emphasis on to a response. You must respond. You must respond. But here he says, it must not be a rash response. Now, I'm sure that among the crowd, there were those who, upon hearing Jesus' call to discipleship, were positively itching to respond, yes, Jesus, I'll hate my mother-in-law. It'll be a pleasure to hate my spouse. I can barely stand her anyway. I'll give up everything. I'll be your disciple. But Jesus wasn't inviting them to a day trip at the beach, was he? It wasn't a stroll in the park. Their commitment could not afford to be spur of the moment. It couldn't be a flash in the pan. And so Jesus tells two parables to drive home his point. The first one is about a man who wants to build a tower for his house. I think it's probably for his house, we don't know. But verse 28. For which of you, desiring to build a tower, does not first sit down and count the cost, whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock him, saying, this man began to build and was not able to finish. In this parable, the man didn't stop to count the cost, and so he failed to finish. Had he approached in a more realistic, measured way, maybe he would have finished. But he didn't, and he was mocked. His foundation with no tower was a sad spectacle to behold. All this work he put in, and what did he have for show for it? A tower, in this case likely a watchtower, is a good thing. It's a great thing. It brings great benefits to your property. But to engage in the task of building one was an expensive undertaking. And a wise builder would not begin building without considering how much it will cost and how to pace it out in order to finish the task. And so, in this parable, Jesus asks the question, come and follow me. Can you afford to? Can you afford to? Jesus is upfront and honest, isn't he? He's not a dodgy salesman with hidden costs. He lays it all out on the table and says, this is the cost of following me. Enter into it fully aware of the costs. The point of the parable is this, that an unfinished tower is a sad spectacle. But an unfinished life is tragic. To respond by following Jesus, only to drift away when things get hard, is a waste. And it's tragically sad. Before you leap in, consider what it may cost to follow Jesus. The first parable asks, can you afford to follow Jesus? But the second parable asks, how could you afford not to? Verse 31. Or what king, going out to encounter another king in war, will not sit down first and deliberate whether he is able with 10,000 to meet him who comes against him with 20,000? And if not, while the other is yet a great way off, he sends a delegation and asks for terms of peace. What will it take for me to be at peace with you? These two parables are parallel, but they approach the issue of counting the cost from slightly different perspectives. In the first parable, Jesus calls the crowd to sit down and consider whether they can afford to follow him. Am I worth it, guys? In this second parable, he calls the crowd to sit down and consider whether they can afford to not follow him. In the first picture, in the first parable, the disciple is pictured as the builder. Here, the disciple is pictured as a king who is at war with another, who is about to go out to war. And the disciple, the king, after counting the cost of the battle, realizes, oh, I can't win. I can't win. I can't do this by myself. There's no chance here of me succeeding. And so he takes the wise approach of pursuing peace with the other king, peace with God, on God's gracious terms. What will it take for us to be at peace? We, like that king, need to look at our lives and look at our chance of survival against him. Because if we're not with him, then we are at odds with him. We need to look at our chances of survival. How can a sinner like me ever hope to stand in front of Almighty God and hope to live? How can I do that? How likely is that to happen? Count the costs. How can I win? The odds are completely against me. I can't win, can I? So what do I need to do? Having counted the cost, having realized that I can't win, the best and only thing I can do is to make peace with the more powerful one. The true disciple knows that he does not have enough money to build the tower, and he knows that he does not have enough troops to win the war. The true disciple does not count upon what he possesses, but rather he renounces what he possesses. The true disciple realizes that salvation is by grace, and the gifts that God gives us are the resources that make possible and enable us to be able to do what he calls us to do. Spurgeon summed up this passage in his sermon on this in 3 points. 1, true religion is a costly thing. 2, wisdom suggests that before we enter upon it, we should count the cost. And 3, cost what it may, it is worth the cost. It is worth the cost. Verse 34 says, salt is good, but if salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is of no use either for the soil or for the manure pile. It is thrown away. Let's be clear here. Jesus once again is warning about the reality of hell. The reality of being cast out, or being of no use. But simply, a life without Christ is without hope. A life without Christ is without purpose. A life without Christ is a life that ends in hell. Is following Jesus costly? Yes. Yes, it is, and yes, it can be. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. If anybody tells you anything different, they are a messenger of Satan, bent on distracting and scattering the sheep. Hear this. Following Jesus can be costly, no doubt, but it is worth the cost. It's worth the cost. To know the remission of sins, to know the wrath of God removed, to know forgiveness, to know love, grace, peace, to know the presence of God, to know life as it was meant to be, to have the hope of a future yet to come. All of that is well worth the cost of temporarily bearing the cross of this life. Do you know these things are spiritual realities in your own life? Do you want to? Do you want to know more about Jesus? Do you want to follow him? Has anything I said this evening made you think, I need to count the cost? Come and speak to me. Don't leave tonight without speaking to me or Rich or one of the elders. A lighthouse keeper along a dangerous coast was given enough oil for 1 month and told to keep the lighthouse burning every night. One day, a woman asked for oil so that her children could stay warm. Then the next day, a farmer came, needing oil for his lamp so that he could study. Still, a week later, another farmer came. He needed oil for his tractor so his fields could be ploughed and planted so that he could feed his family. The keeper saw each as a worthy request and measured out just enough oil for each of them. Near the end of the month, the tank of the lighthouse ran dry. That night, the beacon was dark and 3 ships crashed on the rocks. More than 100 lives were lost. When the government official investigated, the man explained what he had done and why. "You were given one task," insisted the official. "It was to keep the light burning. Everything else was secondary." Our call as Christians is to make Jesus first. Is to make Jesus first. Everything else is secondary. And it's not easy. It's not easy. Anybody who's walked that path for longer than I have, or even less, will tell you it's not easy. Friends and family, they may not understand. In fact, they may even do things to hurt us and hinder us in our walk with Christ. However, we can respond to such a call knowing that the one who calls us is our supreme example and our divine enabler. He's our supreme example. He's already done it. He's gone before us. He's done more. He's gone far and above doing anything he calls us to do. And he's done it all. And therefore, he is our divine enabler. The things he calls us to, he doesn't leave us to manage in our own strength. He's done it. He's already gone to the cross. Actually, so we don't have to go there. He's done it sufficiently so that we may have the Helper, the Holy Spirit, to spur us on and build us up and hold us close. He is our supreme example, and he is our divine enabler, the one who does it, but calls us to do it with him. He perfectly obeyed the will of his Father, allowing no one and nothing to deter him. He went to the cross to purchase salvation for us, to secure for us every spiritual blessing, so that we may persevere, so that we may get to the end. As Jesus called the crowd to a lifestyle of discipleship, he so calls us. He calls us. He says to us, as he says to the crowd, "He who has ears to hear, let him hear." Let him hear. Do you hear? Do you hear him this evening? Do you hear his call? Are you counting the cost? Are you ready? Well, you won't be outside of Christ. And you only can be if you're relying on him. So how will you respond? Let's pray.